As we've examined in previous videos, the church has at best a complicated relationship with power and money. And whenever it pursues one of them, things usually go horribly wrong. The pursuit of money is particularly insidious because it often comes into the church by way of a seemingly innocuous belief taken to extremes, making it hard to root out. Take prosperity gospel televangelists, for instance. You know, the ones who send mail to little old ladies telling them that if they just send in $50, then God will bless them with $500 next week. So they mail in their grocery money and sit by the mailbox waiting for a check. And when it doesn't come, the televangelists blame the little old lady for not having enough faith for God to be able to work, and she should just try again. They are a blight on society and on the church. We know that, but no one denounces them or kicks them out or fights against them. Why? Because there's some truth to what they say. God does heal. God does promise blessings and want faithfulness and faith in God's people. There is truth to what they say, but twisted truth that rips people off in the name of God. And that's just the low-hanging fruit of how the church today both raises money in dubious ways and uses that money with misplaced values. But how can we fight something that is so deeply ingrained in church culture? What works? Fortunately, we have a great example in history of a different time when money had crept into the church and perverted it, this time through indulgences, and what happened when someone stood up to it. And it is both a story of hope and of caution, because while it brought change and the Protestant Reformation itself, it also brought some of the deadliest wars in Europe. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First, some context. In the medieval church, individual prayers of salvation weren't a thing. Instead, forgiveness was seen as being offered by God through baptism, where we are washed clean of sin and guilt through Jesus' shed blood. But that left a problem, because baptism is a one-time event. So what happens if someone sins after being baptized? No one can get to heaven with sin on their record, but people can't be rebaptized every 30 minutes either. So what do? To solve this problem, Catholic theologians turn to confession and penance. That if we confess our sins here on earth, God will forgive us, but the punishment for those sins still has to be paid. Because while forgiveness is still offered to those later sins, their punishment is not covered under Jesus' blood once you've been baptized. This is also where purgatory comes from, as the place where people who have been baptized go after they die, if they die with some sins still on their balance sheet. There the redeemed work off their sins until their balance sheet is clean again and they are ready to enter heaven. This sets up a lot of people for maybe centuries or millennia of effort and suffering and toil before they can finally enter heaven. But fortunately, along with confession, a priest here on earth could also assign penance for the sins that you confess. Individualized restitution to overcome the sin you have committed and speed your passage through purgatory. Things like prayers or giving to the poor or special donations to someone in need. Maybe a pilgrimage. But some good deeds were seen as so good that surely this would help anyone who did them, right? And that right there was the birth of indulgences, writs that the church began giving out at the turn of the millennium for good acts that through their goodness could help speed up a soul's passage through purgatory. Now, normally these had dates on them, so this indulgence was worth 100 days off, or a year, or 100 years, etc. But sometimes they were plenary indulgences, meaning they covered everything. These first appeared with the Crusades, that anyone who journeyed to Jerusalem did something so glorious for God that all of the punishments waiting for them in purgatory would be gone. Initially, the idea was that the priest was simply reassuring you that God had forgiven you and your debt was indeed paid. They were merely acknowledging what Jesus was already doing in heaven, writing off your debts because of your good deeds. But within 100 years, people started believing that the priest actually was the one deciding that the punishment was abated. And from there, indulgences just picked up speed. From only a few instances to more and more until one pope in just 2 years authorized over 400 different possibilities to get an indulgence. Building bridges or cathedrals, attending special services, visiting shrines, or going on pilgrimages all could earn you an indulgence as good deeds. As the use of indulgences rose, so did the church's income from them. And people began to reason that if giving money for a cathedral was a good deed, then surely that same amount of money just given to the church herself directly would also be a good deed. And in 1476, Pope Sixtus IV officially approved indulgences where people could simply pay a set amount of money to the church and have punishment for their sins released. To make matters far worse, this same offer was extended to the dead. Yes, you could pay some money to the church and be assured that your dead loved ones would be immediately released from purgatory without having to work down his or her punishment. Naturally, this raised vast amounts of money for the church as evil but rich people gave vast wads of cash to make sure they didn't have to pay for their crimes in the afterlife. The church was in deep, using faith and fear as a pretext for exploiting people and taking their money. But this was also how they paid for such amazing cathedrals and art and all the monks and the administration and the lavish leaders and lifestyle. I mean, how can you change how the church raises money without changing all of that? And how do you change it without changing the underlying beliefs that led the church down that long road in the first place? Well, in 1517, a monk by the name of Martin Luther gave it a shot and posted 95 theses on the local church's doors about what was wrong with the church. All 95 were on why indulgences were terrible. But basically, it came down to a single point. You cannot sell salvation. And that single point spawned the entire Protestant Reformation. The first thing to change was the theology, but everyone solved it slightly differently. The Anabaptists, literally rebaptizers, changed baptism to something that happens when a person comes to faith. And in doing so, they undermine the necessity of the entire system of penance by allowing people to come to God and ask for forgiveness directly. Martin Luther, on the other hand, went about it a slightly different way. He focused on salvation by faith alone, because indulgences aren't needed if you don't have to earn anything or work off a debt. The system of indulgences also contributed to another reformer, John Calvin's emphasis on the perseverance of the saints, meaning people cannot lose their salvation, because that meant that no one needed to be in fear of the afterlife or could be pressured into giving away their life savings to try and save a loved one who had died. These responses to the issue of indulgences cut its foundation off at the knees among all Protestant groups. And even though indulgences are still part of Roman Catholic doctrine, they aren't sold anymore. The Reformers successfully managed to change the church because they corrected the beliefs that led them there. If we have any hope to change our own situation, we have to do the same. We need a better definition of what church is, apart from just a building. We need a better definition of what giving to God means, other than a 10% tithe. And we need a better theology of what it means to minister, other than paying somebody to do it for us. Sadly, though, almost the only thing the Reformers could agree on about money seemed to be the theology underlying it needed to change. And the problem was that taking away indulgences left a big hole in the church finances, and that hole had to be filled somehow. So many believers simply moved on and found a new source of finances, usually a nation state, which made their version of Protestantism the national religion and funded everything that they needed, just like before. The same churches, the same priests, just Protestant now. The buildings got redecorated, and even some of the fancy art and music disappeared under people like John Calvin, but money still had its hooks in the church. Even the Church of England, which disbanded all the monasteries and convents when they separated from Rome, did so to raise money for the crown, not to simplify the church. Which leads to a second point for today. For any significant change to happen in how the church looks at money, it has to be disconnected from unlimited supplies of it, particularly the government. In fact, it was those groups without state sponsorship who chose to think more deeply about money and the church. Heavily persecuted from all sides, these outcast groups tended to form communities and live simpler lives because they had no choice. They didn't have money for luxury, and so they lived simply and called it blessed. Groups like the Puritans focused on simplicity, minimal adornment, minimal expenses for everything, church included. Other groups, like the Amish or the Moravians, often founded communities where they shared resources with one another, and again, focused on living simply. As they often did not have the money for buildings or paid clergy, groups like the Society of Friends, more commonly known as the Quakers, developed house churches without pastors of any sort that we'd recognize. And they continue to function like that even today. But all of these groups, which successfully cast off any part of money's grip on the church, had two things in common. First, they did so out of necessity. And second, they changed how they looked at money and excess in their own lives, and then applied the same lessons to the church. Because the church is a reflection of our own values amplified. If we don't change how we look at money, we won't effectively change how the church looks at finances. And all of this caused massive shifts in power within Christianity that we're still feeling today. Wars were started over it, and the 30 Years' War alone killed over 8 million people. Change does not come easily, and those who benefit from the current system will fight against that change the hardest. But if we do want to see some change in the church today, especially with how we raise and use money, here are some ideas from history. First, improve the broken theology that led us here. Second, find alternative financing for the pastor, if you have one. No one can be objective about fundraising if they need funds to feed their children. Third, get out from under state support, completely. Yes, losing tax benefits will cause stress, but as long as we have a cushion, we won't change. Fourth, form a community that looks at its own money differently, and change will flow to the church. And fifth, be prepared for pushback from all sides and a lot of discomfort as you try to figure out what church looks like, if it doesn't look like what you know. Well, thank you for coming along on this look at indulgences and how to change the way the church looks at money. I hope you enjoyed it. Come back next week. I'll be taking a look at how the church relates to art. How sometimes it finds God in art and other times it finds the devil. If you want to learn more about how the church has interacted with governments over time, check this video over here. And if you want to take a look at how the church deals with finances today, take a look at this video over here. As always, thank you for watching. Have a great day. See you next video.